what lessons can medicine learn by listening to those who live it every day? What happens when patients advocate not just for themselves, but for others like them? The stories that shape the future of healthcare are the stories we tell today. This is the Patient Perspectives Podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Patient Perspectives Podcast. Today we have a very special guest who I'm just so delighted to have on and to be able to talk to today. It is a true pleasure to introduce Abbey Hauser. Abbey is a young adult rare disease advocate and patient with classical Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, or CEDS. Abbey started advocating for rare disease, disability, and chronic illness after starting their blog Owning My Story in early 2017, once their previously mild condition progressed to impact more of their daily life. Since then, Abbey has found a passion for policy advocacy and joined the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases Board of Directors and is an active member of their Young Adult Rare Representatives Advocacy Program and works in the rare disease nonprofit space. Abbey is passionate about helping patients and families find strength and confidence in their stories to become powerful advocates. Abbey has met with lawmakers on Capitol Hill, served as a consumer review for the congressionally directed medical research programs, and has spoken at various events and webinars for rare disease and adaptive sports advocacy. In their downtime, Abbey is an avid reader, an outdoor enthusiast, and a collector of quotes. And, Abbey is one of those people who I feel like I've known you for years because I first followed the blog and then we connected on Instagram at some point after that. I don't quite remember when, but it's been a while, yet this is the first time we've ever chatted face to face. So this is so wonderful to have you as a guest, and thank you for taking the time.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I was also very excited to finally get to meet face to face because I also feel like I've known you for such a long time.
First, can you start by sharing about yourself related to your diagnosis, anything about your experience as a patient professionally that you feel like would be important for listeners to know?
Yeah, I think, especially for me, my story with classical Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is different than a lot of people that I meet with EDS of any type because I was diagnosed really young. So I was diagnosed when I was like 6 or 7. I think we started the process at 6, like got the diagnosis at 7. Solely because my symptoms were fairly severe at a young age. I was dislocating my knee, like rolling over in bed, and all these things that were like major red flags as opposed to what most people experience at a young age with any form of EDS, which is just joint pain or things that can easily get kind of dismissed, or a lot of kids are hypermobile, so it's really hard to diagnose what's too much mobility in a child. But because I was having these symptoms and my skin was really fragile, especially as a kid, it was like a really quick diagnostic odyssey, which is also super rare. Most of my friends with any type of EDS are about my age, like in their 20s, and a lot of them are just recently diagnosed. Yet it's generally present from birth. They just don't get a diagnosis for a long time. So mine was really quick. I was dislocating my knee a bunch of times, raised a red flag to my pediatrician, who was like, go see this like very specialist orthopedic doctor at a specialty children's hospital we have here in Minnesota. And then at that appointment, because I've recently like gone back through my records, and at that appointment they were like, go see a geneticist for evaluation for EDS. They didn't know what type, but basically at that appointment they diagnosed it. So it really took like pediatrician kind of, I think, was assuming it was this issue, and then that, and then it took a couple more like confirmations in that sense. Um, but then because it was like the early 2000s, we still don't know a lot about EDS, but we knew like nothing then. I have like notes in my records that like of them saying PT wouldn't be helpful, even though it's like a very heavily orthopedic condition. They're just like, yeah, there's nothing you can do. Like just live your life. We'll treat the dislocations and kind of like pick a sport that feels better for your body as opposed to what you want to do with your life, which I think is when my adaptive sports passion came up because I don't like when doctors just assume they know your interests. Because I was told I could swim or play golf or join theater. That was like what a doctor just thought was the only other non-athletic activity one could do. And I don't like, I'm not a good actor. 0% interested. And then I did golf, like our family golfed, and I don't like swimming didn't feel good for my body. So I just thought it was ironic that that was what was recommended. And then my parents were kind of like, well, you can do anything except a contact sport is like the full limit. Um, so they took that like seriously. They didn't want me to get injured in that sense, but otherwise I was able to run cross country, play lacrosse, play soccer, um, kind of all the traditional things. I wore different knee braces as a kid, which definitely made me stand out. But yeah, as a patient growing up, we only spoke my disease in those offices. So I knew that I had something, but I don't think I fully understood what it was until I stumbled upon my own medical records in middle school, which is a really weird time to like learn the name of your disease. But I was looking for something else in my parents' office and I had saw like something that said my name on it. So what kid isn't gonna keep looking to see what that says? And that's when I kind of saw it written out for the first time. And that was kind of when the first thing clicked of like, oh, I actually want to know what's going on in my body. Like I'm actually curious because there was all these weird notes. It was like orthopedic terms that I didn't know, all describing my body, but I was like, I don't understand a single one of these words. So I remember like highlighting them, like noting them down. And then Google was like still fairly new, but I eventually like found a computer and looked them up and kind of I think that's when I started feeling more confident and knowing that something was wrong with me. And I think that was really comforting, and that's why I always advocate for early diagnosis, even if you can't solve, like even if there's no treatment. That like mental aspect for me as a kid, knowing that like my pain had like a cause, and it wasn't just how everyone lived, or it wasn't just this thing that everyone was brushing off. I think that did wonders for me mentally growing up and shaped who I was, and that alone I think is worth an early diagnosis. And then yeah, as I got older, it started affecting my body in ways that we weren't told. Essentially, they were like, yeah, it's just your like knees and joints and call it good. But they didn't fully understand that there was like skin involvement, there's like GI involvement. My bone density started decreasing, which then brought my spine into the picture. And that's kind of when I started my blog and everything, because that's when it became very prevalent in my life as opposed to this like side thing. It became like this full thing that I embodied because it was impacting every moment of every day. And then, yeah, advocacy kind of just took off from there. I met the right people, found the right mentors that got me into policy, and then I'm here. And I've think I've seen almost every specialist. There's a few I haven't ticked off, and I hope I don't have to. But I think I definitely spend a lot of time in waiting rooms and patient offices, and as you all know, that's a weird space to be, a weird space to grow up in. But it also becomes very familiar when you're old enough, so then you kind of know what to look for. And I think it's built my advocacy in that sense, and that I have so much experience as a patient. But I also don't have experience on the other side. So I love when I meet like patients like you that know kind of both sides as well. I think that just only serves to like be a more empathetic and caring provider.
Thank you for sharing all that. And I have to say, I am so impressed that your PCP had it on their radar to, suggest EDS and to
Yeah.
suggest, a further pathway to look into that because that's not the case for a lot of people.
No, he was good. He would like show up to the ER because my dislocations needed ER reduction as a kid. So multiple times he would like pop into the ER, even though he didn't work there. He was like a private practice. But just to check in, and then we stayed with him until I was out of college, even though we moved like an hour away. Solely because I think he was just so committed to that part, at least. And I always say my parents only know the advocacy that they are comfortable with. And I don't know that necessarily they would have gone on to like advocate really hard to get a diagnosis if it was more mild symptoms. So in a
Yeah.
way, I'm kind of grateful that it worked out that way because that was like a very hard to ignore thing. And if a doctor was telling them it wasn't nothing, because I think they just grew up in a generation where you listen to the first opinion
Hmm.
and then it's like considered true. So they've definitely like developed and grown from there, but I definitely know there were multiple times growing up where I knew that they were like, oh, well, he said it's nothing, so it's nothing. And I, like, as a kid was like, well, it feels like something. I think we should maybe. It's like maybe we don't listen to that guy. Like, I don't know that I trust them.
Right. Yeah, I think the awareness of the importance of getting multiple opinions, I feel like that conversation is something that you see a lot more now than, you know, you did 5, 10 years ago. So,
Yeah, for
you
sure.
know, always learning and I think it's important to question and say, oh, maybe this isn't, the right pathway and perhaps we need to get another viewpoint. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. And now I would really love to talk about your blog called Owning My Story that you mentioned. And you write about your experiences so vulnerably in that blog and also on your Instagram page in a way that I think is really admirable because you describe these experiences with such honesty about the realities of living with chronic pain and rare disease, and you don't stray away from sharing the hard moments in your journey. So, first of all, thank you for creating that space where people can find the real and raw realities of living with your condition. But to start, I'm interested in hearing why you named the platforms Owning My Story. What does that name mean to you?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, vulnerability didn't come natural to me as a kid. And I think I always wanted it to be this thing that I shared. So as I got older, I finally was able to find a way that felt comfortable to share what I always wanted to share growing up. So I'm glad that it's resonating with people because it started solely just as a way for me to process what was happening. But I knew that if it helped like one other person, that it was worth putting out there. Um, but owning my story came from my senior year of college was when I got I had like a third stress fracture in my spine. I could no longer, I was on the rowing team in college. I was a coxswain and I no longer could, I got like medically uncleared. I don't know the term for that, but when they like medically retire you, basically, they're like, you can no longer participate. All my friends were on the team, everything, like my whole life revolved around, like when you're a D1 athlete, like your whole team, your schedule is built around practice, like everything is built for this thing. And then I got this thing removed. So I just had all this random free time. I lived with teammates, they were traveling. I got left behind, and it was just this whole weird time in my life. So then, as I was kind of rehabbing again by myself because my teammates were gone and at practice, I would go and listen to audiobooks like while I walked on the treadmill just to like try to get back to running and the things that I loved. And for whatever reason that year I was like really into like the motivational, like powerful books. Like I read a book called Grit by Angela Duckworth that is super good. And that kind of started me like down a path of just like every book that was recommended after Grit, I just like kept reading. And eventually I came across a book by Brene Brown, called Rising Strong. And she has like a whole series basically about the power of vulnerability and just like how it leads to connection, and without it, it builds shame and all these things, and how we cultivate uh, community and connection through sharing the vulnerable moments instead of pretending to be positive. And I believe it's in that book specifically, she has a quote that's like, I'm going to butcher the quote, but it's like when we deny the story, it owns us. But when we Mm, that doesn't sound right. It's like when we deny the story, it does something to us, but when we own the story, we get to like write a brave new ending. And that really resonated with me as someone that was kind of in that like messy middle of not knowing, like my career. My undergrad degree is in kinesiology. My career was supposed to be in sports, and I had a body that was no longer really able to do that very well because I couldn't sit for very long and I couldn't stand for very long. And sports tends to be a lot of both. So all of a sudden, all the 4 years that I'd worked for kind of had disappeared, and I was like, I don't even know where I'm going after college anymore because all the jobs I thought I was going to search for, like I physically can't do. If I can't sit through one college class without going home and like laying in pain, a job isn't gonna quite fit the bill. So I was kind of really in that like messy part of not knowing and not wanting to like bum out my teammates by like sharing this with them because I was like, I felt bad. Um, and that really resonated with me where I was like, oh, if I like embrace this part, if I own it, like I get to choose how it ends. But if I keep pretending that it's fine, it's not gonna, it's never gonna end the way that I want it to. Because eventually it's either you're gonna crash and burn or something bad's gonna happen, or it's just, it eventually comes to a head no matter what. Like you can't not you can't hold that all in and not have it eventually impact you in that way. So I that just really resonated with me. And then when I was thinking up names for this blog that I decided to start, I was one, naming anything is very hard. I learned very quickly. I was like, oh no. First, it has to be a good name. It has to be available. It was just like all of these things. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And since I was getting a domain for a website, I also had to make sure like, is the domain and like the Instagram available? Like, it's a lot more things than I processed, but I was just thinking of things and that phrase just kept coming to my mind, like owning my story. So I had different variations of it. And there were other quotes. I think most of the titles were came from like quotes that I love, because I connect with words that way. But owning my story really just came back to like the crux of what I was hoping to do was just like, this is my story. If it resonates with you, great. If not, like this is my story and I'm like practicing this like vulnerability in a safe space because writing is vulnerable, but you can like put it out there and walk away. You don't have to like sit there and like read it out loud to everybody. Um, so then that's just kind of where it came from. And then the Instagram luckily matched up, and then everything's just kind of grown from there. Currently going through some security website issues because I'm not very tech savvy, but eventually the website will be back and up and running. But my Instagram, I really enjoy what it's become in the community that I've built there. It's a very like positive place in my feed. Like I don't get stressed out by my social media feed that I've kind of curated within that. And I think that's really special and I love it.
Absolutely. Wow, that's really powerful, the meaning behind owning my story. And I think it kind of speaks to taking back the narrative, like you said. And, it can oftentimes feel like these conditions and illnesses take over and control. And to be able to say, I'm going to own this story that I'm living and to create something special out of that is just so cool. So,
Thank you.
um, yeah, it's so cool. Um,
It definitely took, yeah, a lot of work to end up getting there, but when I wrote that blog, like I just knew it was time. I was like, this too many big things are happening. My life has changed, and I would like at least my fa extended family to know without me having to share it every Thanksgiving to be like, hi, my spine is now like very injured, and I can't participate in society in the same way. Like that's a weird conversation to keep having. So part of me started it where I was like, I can just at least share things that people might not have known because I also didn't know what people I grew up with knew because we only spoke my disease in doctor's offices. Like I don't know what like people I've known my entire life actually knew, and I didn't feel comfortable being like, "Hey, let's talk about my condition today." Like that feels like a weird segue, so it also served a little bit of that to just kind of open up, but let people take it in their own time.
yeah, I think that's great. And honestly, I've felt the same way around holidays and like big family gatherings of being like, oh, now I'm gonna have to explain, my whole life to all of the relatives
Yes.
and just to be able to put it on Facebook or Instagram and have somewhere for people to follow and keep up, it takes away that kind of pressure to have to explain everything because it does get exhausting when you get
Yeah,
asked about it multiple
exactly. Even if
times.
they're great people, you're like, I just got done telling Uncle whatever my
Right,
whole
absolutely.
thing, and now I'm like about to like relive the trauma again with you. Like,
Yeah,
like it's a
yeah,
great thing, but I think people forget that even if we're telling it quickly, I'm like, oh yeah, I no longer can work in the field I want. I can say that really lightly, but there's no way that that wasn't like actually like a deep dagger inside of
definitely.
me at the time. But you're just saying it like casually because you're not trying to like get into that in every situation.
Yeah. So once you came up with the title for your blog, what motivated you to continue to share your story on Instagram in that way?
I think it started really like again just from that connection of like I didn't know where I was going with my life. I didn't know everything that I worked for kind of had left, and I felt it was like the first time that I really felt like mentally unmoored. Like I'm usually a very self-confident person, and just by nature, which I'm lucky to have that. But for the first time, I was struck by just like the mental aspect of even just being medically retired from a sport. Like that, I think gets underestimated even in the athletics world where your entire life is one thing. And suddenly in the midst of like a 10-minute conversation with a provider, it's like all taken away through like no choice of your own. Like you didn't walk into that appointment being like, I think I should stop. It's like when you walk in and they're like, you need to stop, otherwise it's like a liability to the university. You're like, hmm. You can't say no to that. It's their
Mhm.
choice. But everything gets taken away from you. So I felt really confident. Like I felt like I had a lot to share through that time because it was just so complex and I was navigating these vulnerable conversations with friends for some of the first time. Some of my close teammates had really known me within my like deepest moments of chronic pain just by nature of them living with me and things like that. So they got to see more of it, I think, than any friend in my life ever had. And luckily they were great and showed up for me and kind of taught me that vulnerability doesn't have to be shameful. Like it doesn't always end poorly. So I think they really helped me feel confident to continue sharing. And then as I was rebuilding from that spine injury, I was fundraising for the Muscular Dystrophy Association. I guess. I ran with their charity team for many years because I've been a camp counselor at the MDA summer camp since I was 16. So it's like 13, 14 years now. And that's kind of how I was advocating was for other people because that felt safer. But I also knew that as I was trying to come back from this thing, I realized I had like one shot to run a marathon. Like I felt like I had this window in my life where I was like, okay, if my spine's been getting worse and I'm 22 years old, it's only gonna get worse. That's just how spines work. And I was like, this might be the time. And I had no desire to run a marathon before I had any surgeries. And the doctor was like, actually, you might not be able to run more than 3 miles. And I was like, joke's on you. I'm doing a marathon. Had no interest prior to that moment of someone like basically back walking on what they like had told me prior to surgery. They're like, yeah, you can get back to your normal running, which was half marathons. And then afterwards, they're like, might only be like 3 or 4, which is super big difference between the two distances. So then as I was training for that, that just felt like a really good time to like be vulnerable and like share how training looks different for me and all these things. And then I ended up deciding to use my crutches towards the end of my training for the first marathon because it was just getting like too impossible. Like my spine was not handling it and it needed some of that removal of gravity with every step that my crutches provide. So then that kind of motivated me to keep sharing because I was like, no one really runs in the same way that I do. So I was like, I'm going to keep sharing that. And then I failed the marathon. And I feel very confident saying I failed because I stopped at mile 22. Um, because of pain, it was like 7.5 hours. It was a whole thing. But I felt confident that I was like, oh, well, now I need to share this because it sucked. But I was like, this is something that I think I would have wanted to read prior to running a marathon is just stories of like it being okay to stop and like what it can still look like and how beautiful like the effort can be. Um, and then I ran it again the next year. So then it was kind of it had like a nice timeline because I was kind of getting goals across. So I was like, oh, I'll share like the journey of this. And then once I completed that goal, which was incredible, but then I kind of just felt I was like, oh, I can keep sharing like whatever kind of comes to mind in that moment. Like I had this clean trajectory, which was nice when you first start something to kind of have like a goal. And now I'm able to treat it just kind of whatever pops into my head, whatever I feel like resonates. I write a lot, so I write a lot of poetry as well. So I've been sharing some of those, which is very new to me and feels like even more vulnerable than sharing like a long form essay, even though it's less words. So I've just kind of got to grow it naturally from there. But I think having those two marathons and like the end of my college career and graduating were really helpful, like stepping stones to get that story across.
And you share and connect a lot with other patients, but is there anything that medical professionals can learn from your story?
Yes, I think I love when I like come across a provider. I'm actually speaking next year with some mental health providers about treating like chronic pain and just different ways that you can do it outside of like the traditional modalities. So I'm talking about like how I have a glimmer journal and I like always search for like the small positives while not like denying the joy. So that's like the mental health side of it. But those providers, I think I've they came to me like through my page. They were like, we're really interested in everything that you've shared, and it's just so like interesting in a new perspective of how to kind of take it on because I do feel very like mentally adjusted. Like I definitely go to therapy, but I always feel like I've just was the right person to have chronic pain if we like had to give it to people, I guess. Like my mentality is just very like upbeat and it's easier to kind of overcome the negative in like my personality. But doctors themselves, I've even ironically, I don't even think he knows this, but I cross country sit ski and last year my volunteer that was assigned to me at the race that I did was my orthopedic surgeon as a child.
Oh my gosh.
And I don't think he made the connection and I was like, I don't know that I want to like bring this back up. Because I saw him a bunch of times and he did like my gait analysis and prescribed like my orthotics and did all that. But he started talking and the longer we were skiing, I was like, I feel like I know you. And then I finally like got his name and I was like, oh, I definitely know you. But he actually learned a lot even just from interacting with me in that moment because he like followed the blog, he like read an email or sent an email later about like one of my poems that I shared about like it's called Where Do Stories Go, but it's about like scars being repeatedly cut open. Um and he commented on that one. Like that one really resonated with him as a surgeon, I think, which I hadn't really thought about because I reference in that poem a surgeon where I'm like, when they cut open my scar, like did my story spill on that operating room floor? So I do like reference the medical field, but I really didn't think of how that would connect to him. But he like wrote and he goes, I love this perspective. Like I loved being able to like ski with you. He's like, if you ever want to like chat more like with the hospital or like other things. And I think just seeing patients outside of the clinical setting and how they navigate life is a huge benefit, especially like, if they're not your patient, but you can kind of take that mentality to be like, oh, there are ways we can get our patients like more active. There are adaptive sports. We don't have to just say golf and swimming in the orthopedic world when someone needs to be like gentle on their joints. We can like offer like a wheelchair sport. We can like recommend programs. So I think that in the orthopedic field, especially, I think I've had more providers be like, I like hadn't realized what was available for people that weren't only like spinal cord injury or a cerebral palsy or a spina bifida in terms of like sports access. And then I think just like sharing the complex nature of it and hearing it from that side without it being in the depths of like that moment. Because when you're in an appointment, you're sharing like that vulnerable thing that's your symptom, but you're not going to like talk about the rest of your life. You're not going to talk about how it impacts like every moment of your life because you don't have time. But I think if like you can kind of process how someone might, and I'm always really careful to always say that like I recognize that my personality affords me a lot more, I think like benefits and opportunities in coping. And that's not how everyone should. So I'm like always, even like a provider's like, oh, this is great, like whatever. And I'm like, just remember, not everyone copes the same way, and that's totally fine. Like no one, I shouldn't be the goal because I'm just doing what feels natural to me. So we shouldn't like force people beyond what's natural to them. But I think it does help to kind of see what I think like I don't want to say that I'm like the most optimistic person, but I feel like I very much veer very optimistic. So I think it is helpful to see what kind of like that could look like and then know that like that could be a goal that you want your patients to get to and where you want them to like survive and thrive and like what proper pain care and pain management can get you is a more fulfilling life. And it's when we don't treat it or don't treat it effectively or treat like the bare minimum that you lose some of that like vibrancy of life.
I think providers can always learn something from patients,
Yeah.
and that kind of, you know, plays into patient-centered care and really understanding the patient that's in front of you outside of their diagnosis and outside of their condition. Because then you can make more appropriate recommendations for, like you said, adaptive sports or really connecting them with resources that will be the most meaningful to them.
Yeah.
So, in making those decisions about your treatment and getting to know your medical teams, I know those decisions can often be very daunting. So, how did you approach those decisions, and what do you wish providers understood about the emotional side of the decision-making process?
This is a really great question. I think when I think back to like my pediatric options, I was young-ish. I didn't have a surgery till I was older because we kept postponing. But at that age, you don't fully have a say. Like you do, but like at the end of the day, it's not your call. And I did have quite a few surgeries recommended to me, but I'm not sure that they were communicated well enough to my parents. Because like I go back through my records and it's like all these like I recommend this, I recommend like that, but no other like, follow-up was pursued. And I'm just I get to me it really feels like no one fully was like this could help or like we actually like I'm not sure it was made very clear. So I think part of that, like when you're a kid, it's like a lot of the parents um understanding of what you're offering as a procedure. Um, and then there was one that I was older and my parents thought it was too aggressive of an option. Um, and I kind of agree, but we ended up finding like a second opinion and did a different surgery that was still fairly invasive. Because it was just the nature of like you still break a bone. Like it's not a small surgery. But we found a different one that was willing to do that instead of operating on like four places at once. And I was definitely more involved in that decision. And I remember like instigating that and being like, I want to go to college and have my knees more stable. Like I was terrified. It's still my biggest fear of like getting injured in public. I think it's probably everyone's fear. I don't know that they like realize it's a fear, but like just the thought of like getting so severely injured in public where you're still conscious, but you're like on the ground in pain feels like that's like too vulnerable for me. And I was going away to college and I was like, I do not want to roll over in bed and have my college roommate like hear me cry. I was like, that's no, thank you. I would like to minimize that as much as possible. And I knew there was the really invasive surgery on the table that they thought could fix it. So then I was the one that was kind of like, okay, well, we need to either pick this one or like we need to go to the other one. And my parents at the time, I think, were concerned about me retaining athletic ability and they just couldn't guarantee it with the more invasive one. They were like, we can introduce you to one family that has a kid that did it, and he's like kind of active. But it was like kind of like a vague offer. It wasn't super pursued. And I think as a young person, like your goals are different. And I think that's what you go into thinking like, ideally, obviously, I would want like less pain and more function. But my main goal at that point was like, can we physiologically like reduce the chance of my knees dislocating because my knees, while my ligaments were really loose, my kneecaps also sat like nowhere near the groove, so it could jump ship very easily. There was nothing holding it in really, so it made it easier. So I was like, well, if we can, I was like, I see the X-ray. I've studied science now. Like I am 18 years old. I think I turned 18 the day before my surgery, so like I was the one signing away those consent forms. Very quickly, I was like, oh, wasn't prepared for that. So that went into that one, and then my spine. Well, I guess then my screws broke at my surgery, my second knee surgery, and I was in college at this point, so I was like 19 years old, and that one I kind of had to pursue completely alone, which is like brand new ball game. But my surgeon was like, "That seems fine. Like, come back in a couple months." And to me, I was like, "This bone is not attached." The screws are like floating. They are cut in half. I was like, I just think maybe waiting isn't the play. So I was the first one that had to finally go get a second opinion, and that was really emotional as a 19-year-old because I didn't know what I was doing. Luckily, I was a student athlete, so really I went to my athletic trainer and I was like, "Hi, my doctor said this. Like, what do you recommend?" And she got me in with a different surgeon, and that surgeon was like, "No, we need to fix it now." And I don't think the like immediate surgery type is as recognized as an emotional burden because they're kind of like, well, it's like, nope, like now. It's like we're fixing it. And it just like it did my senior year of college, it like removes everything that you've known. So I think there's just like a little bit more of recognizing that saying those like simple words, even if it's just like a knee surgery, like in the grand scheme of surgery is not like the most invasive. It still alters everything that person is going to go through for the next 6 months to a year. And especially when it's said to someone young, I'm not sure that longevity is always included in the discussion because I'm constantly asking my doctors, like, what happens when I'm 60? Like, what happened? Like, what did we like? What if, and they don't know. And I think they're always surprised when I ask. So that's another big thing where I'm always looking for like functionality and that, but then the emotional aspect of someone telling you that is my reaction is to shut down. Like I will ask no more questions. I will schedule the appointment. Like I will go on autopilot. Um, and I'm sure like my demeanor probably changes, so it's probably obvious, but I'm not someone that's gonna like immediately start like asking all these questions to get it all through. I just kind of like freeze, and that I think also needs to be recognized a little bit better as an emotional response. Because I think it's taken as someone, I think it gets taken as like, oh, they're just like very mature and like they understand the process, where like in reality, I've just like, I'm like, oh, no, we're done. Like I'm not gonna cry in this office. I was like, I don't know you. And I cry very easily, but I try not to. So then shutting down is the option in that sense. So um, it's very interesting in that kind of emotional response where like I'm looking for longevity, but also emotional responses can also look like no response at the same time.
I think that's a really important thing to consider that everyone processes these decisions and options differently. And I think I'm very much like you, where, sometimes I will just kind of freeze because I don't want to be crying in front of my doctors
Yeah,
either.
it's
And
so
that can
awkward.
be
You're like, I know they don't care. Like, I know they're like, this happens all the time. But to me, I'm just like, well, I don't really like, I would rather like cry in the car in the parking lot and like be able to like fully process than have to like have them all of a sudden comfort me. Like, at that point, I'm just trying to get out of the office as soon as possible. If I have more questions, I'll be my chart messaging later. But like, in that moment, I'm just trying to like flee as quick as possible.
right. Yeah, it can be difficult to navigate all of that. But
Yes.
in finding the right surgeon for your care team, what advice do you have to other patients about identifying providers who respect and include them in their care decisions?
I I recommend knowing or at least testing out what your like personality type is and what you want from a doctor. Like, do you want someone that's going to tell you all the decisions, essentially, like make them for you? Or do you want someone that's going to be like, here's three options. What do you want? Those are like two different approaches. Um, and some of them have different experiences and different ones. Most of the time, I prefer my providers to be the ones that are like, here's the tray of options. Here's some like risks or whatever. Like, what do you want? And then that only comes back to bite me sometimes when I'm in like more of like a crisis and I would just like someone to tell me what to do. I'm like, I don't want to have to pick. I don't know. I was like, I didn't go to medical school. Maybe don't give me these options. So if that like feels like your response style to just getting options on like a general day about just like general like basic care, then definitely seeking out surgeons that seem like they might give you a couple options or they might give you something, or they might just be like, you know what, I think this is best. Here you go. So it takes a little bit of knowing, and I don't think you know what you like until you have it. So it does take some time to kind of figure out who you like. Someone might come like world renowned, but if you don't click with them and don't feel like safe in their care, I think that's a very important thing to listen to as a patient. Um, it might not be anything that they did. It might just be like personality clicking, and that's totally fine. I think it just because they're the best in the world. In certain cases, you have a choice. Obviously, some cases, if it's like emergent, you like really don't have a choice in who's helping you. Um, but if you do, kind of like learning what feels right and knowing that if it doesn't feel right, then you're probably correct and that it's not right for you. And that's okay. Like you don't have to call them and be like, I'm quitting you. And like you don't have to let them know. You can just not schedule again and start somewhere new. Um, and you might, sometimes testing around for doctors is tricky, but I think it starts with knowing what you like. I like as a professional patient myself, I like someone that I can just ask to be like, can you get this x-ray? Can you get this MRI? Because I can speed up time because I know that that surgeon's going to ask for an updated MRI. So if I can then go to my PCP and be like, can you just get me a spine MRI quick? Like refer me. And then I go to that appointment and I already have it done. And then we don't waste time that way. And she's great about it. But if I were to ask her, like, do I need one? She might not know. Um, so it kind of comes and goes. But when I'm picking a surgeon, it definitely has to feel right. I'm kind of in the middle of like identifying spine surgeons right now, just to like have on the table because we're waiting as long as possible for spine surgery, but I've been definitely like meeting with a few to see do I even like them so that I know that if it becomes like an emergent issue, I like have someone on my team that I can go to as opposed to again picking the first person that's has an opening. So sometimes it does take a little bit of forward thought and it gets weird because you just kind of go in and you're like, hi, I have a spine issue, and then you just see what they say. But sometimes that's okay. Like that can be all the appointment is. You don't have to like continue with the follow-ups. You're allowed to just check it out. And I mean, it costs money to check it out, but like you're okay to, do that and see what fits. And I think it's definitely helped me find the right care team in that sense.
Yeah, I love all of that advice. And I think it's important for patients to realize exactly what you said, which is that, you could be recommended to go to a certain doctor, and if you don't feel like it's the right fit, then it's your right to, and really it's for the best to find a team that you feel the most comfortable with, even if it's not the first
Yes.
person that you were recommended to, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's so hard when you get a referral and you're like, oh, it's got to be good. But if it just doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. It's like a friend, like you know if someone's going to click or not. And they don't have to be your friend, but you know when someone feels not correct. And it's really hard to turn that first feeling around. So you'd have to like really be committed to that person, or if you just knew they were the only person that can do whatever you're looking for, if it's like a complex surgery, then sometimes you're forced to kind of work on that relationship a little bit. Then it becomes a little bit trickier, but you are able to kind of push back and ask questions and try to get what you want out of a provider if you are kind of stuck with a certain one for whatever reason too.
Yeah, definitely. To kind of switch gears, can you
Yes.
share about your involvement in the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases and your journey towards advocacy as a patient?
Yes. Thank you for asking. I love the EveryLife Foundation. I heard of them first. I started my blog. Someone from Minnesota here where I live connected with me somehow, and she was like, "I want to like meet for coffee," and we met. And then she was like, "I want you to speak at the state capitol on Rare Disease Day," and I was like, "What? Me? Like you don't know me from Adam. Like you just have like read my blog a few times." And she was like, "No, like I think your story is really important and it can really connect to what we're talking about." And then she kind of got me on the advocacy path because we were working on getting a rare disease advisory council established in Minnesota. Or they were, and I just kind of hopped in to help in the middle of it. But she kept asking me. She kept saying like, "Would you testify for this bill? Would you go to the state house committee? Would you test?" Like she just kept asking, and I credit her. Her name's Erica Barnes. She's a great advocate here in Minnesota, and I credit her with this motto that I came up with for advocacy for myself, and that if someone asks me to do something, and the only reason I want to say no is because I'm afraid or don't think I'm qualified to do so, I have to say yes. I can say no for like scheduling or if it doesn't feel right, but if it's solely because I'm just a kid, like I can't testify in Congress, then I have to say yes, and that has gotten me so much further because it's opened so many doors. And I started there, loved Minnesota, left the state for grad school, didn't want to advocate in the state that I went to grad school in, and I remembered in the back of my mind that EveryLife was a thing and that they had a young adult program and that they did federal policy. So I was like, perfect. I can do that from wherever I am. So I joined them right at the pandemic. Great time to like join a group. But they ended up having an incredible young adult leadership academy. And I was in the inaugural cohort of students, and we learned from professionals throughout the advocacy field about different ways that you can participate in rare disease advocacy, whether it's like joining a board, working for the FDA, working, for NIH, advocating on the Hill, being a lot like all these things. And all these people took this time to like teach us, and they were so excited for like this new set of advocates. And that really buoyed my confidence because like a random adult was super excited to meet with us at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday. Like that's kind of unheard of, and they're like all wanted to. Like it was not hard finding the faculty for that program. And that kind of got me hooked. And then I was invited after that leadership academy, our class was invited to apply to the board of directors to fill our first young adult seat on the board. So they're trying to work really hard in terms of um, diversity, but also including age in that diversity spectrum of what a board looks like, because most boards are a lot older and they skew male, is generally how boards tend to work. So I was definitely and am the youngest by like a decent amount. And that was great. You're like still a full voting member. They're just keeping that seat so that they always keep a young adult on it. It really, you have full voting privileges. You're a full board member, and it's a 3-year term, with the option of them to vote you on the next year or choose not to. So I served my 3 years and just got voted to continue on for my next term. And I've grown a lot through there, and I love their programs. I was chair of Rare Disease Week last year, which was a huge honor. I got to speak and give our keynote address and just kind of connect with advocates, and it's just become my favorite part. Is I like telling my story, but it's really my favorite part to connect all these other advocates and motivate them to share their story, because I know that I can be that friendly face for them, just by my energy alone and excitement for like people meeting their lawmakers for the first time. Like I want them to get their story across. I want them to feel safe sharing their story. So kind of now getting to be in that role where I kind of shepherd their stories in our meetings, where I run our meetings with our lawmakers in DC, but I usually share my story last because I'm like, they all know me by now. So I'm more excited to get all these other advocates to share their story, to talk about bills that matter to them. And EveryLife has really given me all the tools to do that. I always say I'm a board member and I don't do any like extra studying besides programs that they offer. And I feel like I'm a very informed advocate. Like that's enough. Like I don't have to go home and like study extra to learn about the bill, because at the end of the day, it's your story that matters. And there are policy experts that are doing the policy. Like we don't have to be in charge of that. So as long as you know your story, you know how it connects, and you're kind of telling it in this powerful way, that's really all you need to know. And the EveryLife team and the staffers kind of take over the rest. And I think that's the biggest hurdle of policy advocacy, is everyone assumes you have to know the ins and out of every bill. We like teach you enough about the bills that you go talk about at our conference, but if you don't know an answer, you're always welcome to say, I don't know. I will reach out to the EveryLife Foundation and they will get you an answer. So we're never expecting anyone to know everything. And I think that's just been a really incredible way to use my story further. I have a really good connection now with Senator Klobuchar in Minnesota, who actually shares my story every time she's talking about our rare disease congressional caucus, or really just trying to get her other, lawmaker colleagues, friends, I don't know what you call them. Whenever she's trying to like get them to join or care about rare disease, she usually shares my story, and her team has done a really good job of like taking care of it, and quoting different things that I've written, but just kind of using it in the right way. And it's never felt like I was being exploited, and it's always just like a very good use of it. And well, at a certain point, I'm like, you can probably pick someone else now. I do feel very honored that she feels connected enough to that story of one of her constituents to keep sharing it, and that's something that my story has done. And I'm working on like accepting that and being proud of that, instead of like wanting to put someone else in the spotlight all the time.
Do you think being so involved in advocacy initiatives and groups have helped you to become a better advocate for your own care?
I think so. I think it also helps, and I know it's one of those like unfair disparities that I walk into a room and I just appear more intelligent and like well informed. I think just by the way that I speak and the way that I interact with people, and that tends to, fortunately for me, but unfortunate for just like society, it does get me, I think, a little bit better care and treatment, because I walk in and appear well informed and educated on the matter, but not pushing it. Like it's just by no fault of my own. Like I feel like I just start talking and someone's like, "Oh, you know what you're doing," and half the time I don't. But it's just like the it is what it is, and I know that it definitely has afforded me better pain management care, and it's afforded me better just like medical care in general. But knowing the policy has definitely helped me become an advocate, even just like in my workplace, of like knowing what like rights I have, and knowing that there's like policies to back up rights, and knowing that like there's steps that I could take, whereas before I probably would just like vaguely know that there's something I could, refer to that would back it up. But now I know I'm like, there's probably a policy somewhere that I can do it. And I have enough friends and people that I know that it could help me find it if I needed to. So I think I always struggle on like the self-advocacy front. Like I said, I think it's because I shut down. That's like my go-to. Move in an appointment, especially if I don't like a provider. Like I like immediately am like, I'm gonna say the least amount of words to like get out of here because I know it doesn't feel right. Whereas I probably could try, to break that like feeling. But I'm also just really in tune with my gut where I'm like, if it feels wrong, I don't know how to make it feel right. So that's definitely still something I'm working on is like the standing up for yourself in these vulnerable moments. Because policy, you're sharing your story, but it's like a little less vulnerable because you're like in a Capitol Hill building and you're like, okay, this doesn't feel as like vulnerable as sitting in an exam room. So it's a little bit different in that sense, but I'm always working on that skill of being able to stand up for myself in moments of like wanting better care or like, in that moment, my go-to is usually just to find someone else in the background and not advocate in that moment. So that's something I'm always working towards. But I definitely know I've met some other advocates that have really come to life from learning these policy skills, and now they feel like confident speaking up for themselves in more situations. And I really admire that. And I think that is a benefit of learning how to share your story and connect it and just like feel confident speaking to someone that might feel intimidating, like a lawmaker or a staffer does.
Yeah, as we near the end of the episode, and speaking of vulnerability, on your social media, you have a series called Views from the Floor.
Yes.
And I resonate so much with this. And I think it's really stems from a powerful place. So I'd love to hear how you started what I'll call a movement and what it means to you, what it's like to create community around a place that's actually a lonely spot for patients like us, and that spot being the floor.
Yeah, well, thank you. I feel honored that it's a movement. That feels like a great goal of mine. Um, yeah, it really started with because my spine has issues with like compression and juvenile degeneration. Removing gravity has always felt the best for me, which by default is laying down. I don't know how else to remove gravity. Until we get like sweet zero gravity suits, then we'll be good to go. But for now, it's the floor. And I had done the dishes one day, like 8 a.m. before going to work, and I was waiting for my mom, who we worked together at the time. And like my back already hurt so bad just doing the dishes at 8 a.m. And I was like, well, this day is about to suck. But she wasn't ready yet. So I was like, I will lay on the floor. And I already was fully dressed or had my shoes on. So I laid with my shoes on the wood floor where we're allowed to have shoes and then put my body on the carpet because I didn't have shoes there. Weirdest spot to lay. So it's like between kitchen and living room. Not a spot that anyone does. But I looked up and just like the angles of like one of our chandeliers and like the light shining through and the staircase, it just looked new and cool. And I was like, what a cool view. So I took a picture of me like laying on the floor. You can like still see my feet and knees. And I titled it, the title of my non-existent memoir will be Views from the Floor. And then from there, I just kind of started sharing. Anytime I was on the floor, I would just call it like Views from the Floor, added a trademark. It's not really trademarked, which maybe I should work on that, but the trademark makes it fun. So I would add it and then I would kind of like continue sharing whatever I was sharing. Because no matter what, I was already on the floor and usually my pictures were from the floor. I just wasn't like addressing that it was the floor. But it came from this place because you don't go to the floor because you want to. I mean, sometimes you do, but most of the time it's like I need immediate removal of gravity to like try to carry on my day, which inherently is very lonely, especially if you're, stuck somewhere where you can't remove it. Like if you're at work or at a desk all day and you can't go lay down to remove gravity. Like for me, that feels even more lonely because I'm like, I know the thing that will make me feel better is inaccessible to me in daily life. Like it's only accessible kind of when you're home alone or like in a safe public place that you know the people. So it's very lonely because half the time like I'm there at the end of the day and it's like you're just trying to like feel better enough to go to sleep and like start the day over again. So I really just kind of started sharing, and then I had friends start sharing it as well on their Instagram, and I really loved that. And then I think I had this one from my deck of like the clouds, like a time lapse of the clouds moving by, which again, we don't all like look up and look at the clouds very often from that view. And that's when a friend was like, you should put these like you should give these a permanent home somewhere, like make a page as opposed to stories that disappear. And I thought about it and I was like, I don't know, that seems kind of silly. But then I was like, you know what? Yeah, why not? Like that seems like a great way to keep it and connect it and make it more of like a permanent thing for someone to stumble upon if they need to. Um, and then I forget the quote that I picked, but on the profile, there's a quote by Sylvia Plath that is about the floor. And I read it in a poem once and I was like, oh, she gets it. She was a floor kid. Like she knows what's up. So I titled it with that. And I love sharing and I love when other people share because it builds this connection from this lonely moment where I can reach out to people from the floor without needing to say I'm in pain because that feels really vulnerable to just like share that all the time because I'm like, that's just a state of being. But if I share this is a view from the floor and it looks cool or it's like a nice like corner or something new, people connect with it and then we respond and it builds a conversation and it's secretly built around pain, but we're not going like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Like that sucks. Like instead you're like, what a cool view. Like that's a cool like artwork that you have in that corner or like this building is cool. So it kind of built like a new connection around it where I know it's about pain, but the conversations that come from it don't sound like they're from pain and it builds that just further community. And I'm very excited whenever I see anyone else tag me in something. Because I like seeing it and then I know that I'm not alone because we don't talk about when I tell a doctor I like the floor, like when they're always like, what's the most comfortable position? That's like the most common, like orthopedic and like chronic pain question. And I always am like, oh, the floor, like laying flat on the floor. And they're like, oh, okay. And they like move on. But I don't think they think about like what that looks like for someone where it's like, it's you on the floor at your house in the most random positions because you just like needed to immediately remove gravity. Um, so I love that it builds that connection and I hope it continues growing. But even if it doesn't, I'm not very like marketing savvy. So I usually just let things kind of naturally grow and build from that. And it's worked well for my page. So I think views from the floor will go the same way.
Like I said, I think it's such a neat way to connect with other people, but then also it is putting a picture to what it really means. Like you said, to tell a doctor that the most comfortable position is on the floor, you're now putting a picture to that and showing
Yeah.
others what that really looks like. And I think that is even more powerful. So I
Thank
love
you.
I just love that you do that. And
Thank you.
I've certainly resonated with it throughout my spinal cord and spine
Yeah.
issues. And, because it's something that not everyone understands, but when you do understand it, it can be lonely and it's not a fun thing to be able to understand.
Right. I'm like, well, it'd be nice to just like go there because I wanted to like hang out there. But usually it's
Right?
like an immediate need where I'm like, I would like everything hurts. And I think if we just chilled on the compression front for like 10 minutes, I might be able to like carry on with the rest of my day.
Yeah, I totally get that. So we have now reached the final segment of this episode, which is kind of a new thing that I'm introducing on the
Yeah.
podcast. But this final segment, the working title right now is Memorable Moments. If you or anyone listening have any other suggestions, but this final segment is a time to share a recent reflection, piece of advice, or meaningful anecdote from our experiences as a patient that have stuck with us. So this could be a lesson or advice for fellow patients, or even something providers can take away to improve care. And I just my hope for it is that it's a way to end the episode with a thought that resonates with listeners long after the end of the episode. So I can go first
Yeah.
to give you a moment to think about yours.
Yes, I'd love to hear yours.
So something that I have been thinking about a lot recently, and I don't really know why it's been on my mind now, but when I had my arm lengthened about 3 years ago, the initial conversation that I had with my arm surgeon was, she had presented it to be done with an internal lengthening rod rather than an external fixator. And with my legs, I had had experience with both of those types of devices. And during the appointment, the internal lengthening rod is kind of a newer technology.
Yeah.
And it is less invasive than an external fixator. So she had presented it that way, and she felt like that would have been the best way to move forward with the lengthening. And then I remember on the train ride back to school afterwards, I was thinking about it, and I was like thinking about the logistics of, I would be doing the lengthenings myself each day, which meant like
Mhm.
with the internal rod, it meant like holding up a big machine and lining it up with where my bone was broken. And it
Yeah.
just felt very cumbersome knowing, what it was like to lengthen my leg with an internal nail, which that it's easier to just be able to rest a machine on top of your leg. But
Yeah.
to be able to like do
True.
it,
Yeah. Arm is
against
tricky.
gravity and like on your arm. It just felt very difficult to be able to do it independently. And so I was thinking about that and how I had just felt more comfortable with the external fixators I had prior. So I sent her an email and I explained all of these reasons why I, you know, wanted to have a conversation about whether we could do it with an external fixator. And
Yeah.
she listened to me and she appreciated that I had really thought about it and reached back out. And, she felt like the reasons why I wanted to pursue it that way, were valid and they made sense for my specific situation because I would have been living alone and, like I said, doing it all very independently. So, finding the system that allowed me to do it most comfortably was important. And I think for her to recognize that and to value my perspective and the ways that it was going to be impacting me every day, right? I was the one who was going to be going through this
Yeah.
invasive procedure and to be considering my viewpoint of it and respecting that as a patient. I thought that was really cool. And
Yeah.
I ended up having a pretty like long journey with that arm lengthening, as I'm sure you saw online. But I guess maybe I've been thinking about it lately because I'm like, wow, I really need to thank her for really respecting my values at the time and
Yeah.
like respecting my input. And I thought it was so cool that I didn't really have to like fight for that decision to be made. It was like, oh,
Yeah.
these are my thoughts on our discussion, and she just like took it with open arms and was, respectful of it. So that's kind of my memorable moment is to, really respect and understand your patient's values and goals and what will be important to them in their treatment.
Yeah. I love that she wasn't like, oh no, I only do internal, so you have to. Like, she didn't keep pushing. Because that's also when I get worried too, is like when something like keeps getting pushed after you've like said, I prefer something else.
Yeah.
So that's like very, because it's, everyone has their preferences, so there's a chance that like she easily could have gone the other way. So I love that she was like, oh, like that's respectful. And that's also how I love to answer questions is like, I'll email you later. I'm like, I don't have questions right now. Let me like think on it for a couple days and then I'll come back to you with like a lot of thoughts. But if you ask me in that appointment, I can't come up with what I need to like request. So I love that she also respected the email and not being like, well, why didn't you say this in the appointment?
Yeah, definitely. I think it goes down to every patient processes differently. And I think
Yeah.
she learned quickly that, sometimes I can come up with questions during a clinic appointment, or like I'll come with my list of questions. And even when I do that, I still have questions afterwards.
Right. All the time. You're like, wait, I now I have like seven more.
Yeah. So, what is your memorable moment?
I was thinking about this and I think I have a good one because I recently hurt my spine in October and I was in the hospital for a week. I acutely injured it. Don't really know how. That's like just how my body goes. But it went way worse way quickly. Normally it's just like we do a steroid pack, we're good to go. But suddenly, 2 days after it, the initial like minor injury, I could no longer move like without severe pain. So big problem. Was in the hospital for a week, and my um, luckily I went to like a community. Like usually get most of my care at like a suburban community hospital, honestly, because I get care quicker than I do at like our University of Minnesota or like bigger Minneapolis centers. So I kind of switched over there. So they had openings, so they were more than willing to take me on. Just like I couldn't function, like I couldn't move solo, and I couldn't. Pain wasn't managed, so it was like a normal reason for admission, but they kind of quickly reached their like limit of what they knew. But they were it's kind enough for me to. I was like, well, if you reach out to my spine and pain practitioner, who is like my favorite group of practitioners I've ever worked with, still in their same hospital system, I was like, reach out to them, like they know my spine really well, like see what she wants to do. And she recommended a bunch of treatment, like in the ER, imaging, like in the ER. PA was like, "We'll do it all." Like, sounds great. So she was kind of like guiding from behind. But throughout that whole experience, everyone was kind of like, "Oh, like that sucks." Like the doctor's like, "I don't really know what to do." The hospitalist was like, "We'll keep trying stuff." So we just like were really trying to get my pain below a 7 out of 10 when moving. That was my discharge goal, which is a terrible discharge goal. But for me, I was like, "That's better than what I'm at." Where like nothing was touching it for days. And my nurse practitioner, who I love at my spine and pain clinic, had already scheduled an appointment for me. Like she's like, I'm hoping you get out of the hospital by next week, so I scheduled you for like Monday. If we need to move it, like we'll move it. But she like immediately wanted to see me, which is the first time I've ever had kind of like a practitioner like taking over behind the scenes like that, like on my behalf that I know about. I'm sure it's happened before. But that whole week, like really everyone was just kind of like, "Oh, that sucks." Like the nurses were like, you look terrible. Like this is not working. But no one was really giving like compassion. Like they were kind, but like everyone was kind of like, "You're really young for this to happen. Like what's the injury?" And I always have to be like, I don't know. Like we maybe a new stress fracture. It's like MRI is too tricky to read. No one knows. But so I finally get discharged in a ton of pain. And I walk in, and she's known me for like 4 or 5 years now. So we have a really good relationship. And I walk in, and we like run through it all. She can like already tell I'm like moving terribly, like I'm barely, making it. And I give her the rundown because she had only heard through doctors and like my chart messages. But she stops before she continues anything else. She puts her hand on the table, like looks me in the eyes, and goes, "I am so sorry this happened to you." And that alone was like all I needed to hear. Like that's what I needed in the weeks prior. Like if you don't know the answer, that's fine. But like I just needed to be met with some compassion within that sense of it. So like the second she said that, I just felt this like relief where I was like, "Oh yeah, this does suck. Like I don't have to be okay with this." And like we still won't know exactly why it got so bad. And I told her, I was like, "That's fine. It is what it is. I'm used to it." And she goes, "Well, you shouldn't have to be." And she goes, like, "I'm so sorry that that happened. Like, let's figure out a plan." And she prescribed way better medication than we were using inpatient. And she kind of was the one that was able to get a handle on it through like injections and other things. And is still getting me back to functioning. But it was like that soul moment where she just put her hand on the table, like stopped before continuing like a plan of care and just acknowledged that it was hard and that it sucked and that like changed everything. I didn't know that that's what I was looking for until she said it. And I don't like it's not like we need pity in every appointment, but when you share a symptom, like it's very clinical because we're in that clinical setting, but technically it's very vulnerable. Like we're sharing about this like terrible thing that's happening to us or that's disrupting our lives or that could be somewhat embarrassing to like share publicly depending on what it is. But because it's so clinical, we don't treat it as vulnerable. So then I don't think we're always acknowledged as patients that what we just shared was extremely vulnerable. Like those are things that we might not even tell to family or friends. But because it's clinical, it's just like, "Oh, okay, like moving on. Like let's talk about it like very seriously when like you've just shared this like incredible vulnerable thing." And sometimes I think we just need to be met with that compassion and empathy just a little bit more. Like even if you can't solve it, if someone is like, "I'm so sorry that happened, like that sucks. I don't know what's happening, but like let's try to figure it out or let's like refer you." Even if it's like a referral that gets me nowhere and it's a dead end, I feel 10 times better walking out of that appointment where someone has been like, "That sucks. Like that is so sorry that's happening. Let's see what we can do." And even if we can never solve anything, like I feel 10 times better than I do when I share all this vulnerable stuff and they're just like, "I think it's just probably your disease." Like that's probably all we got. Like stay the course and then you like leave.
I don't feel any better about that because we haven't solved anything. But even if we don't solve anything and someone goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry that that's happening. Let's see what we can do." I feel better even if this result is the same. So I think that just like stands out to me as a memorable moment. And I just saw her again yesterday, and every time she sees me, she's always like keeping track of like things that she doesn't have to. She's like tracking my whole body. She's like, "How's this one other thing?" I was like, "You are." She's the one that like got me diagnosed with osteoporosis, and I was like, "You are like a pain and spine clinic, but you just like saw my results and were like, this doesn't track. Let's get you to endocrinology." And she's just like very involved. But I think she's involved because she leads with that subtle compassion. Like it's not like it's overwhelming. I don't feel like I'm coddled, and I don't feel like, I'm pitied at all. It's more just like, this sucks. You're handling it very well, but like, it still sucks. And I think that's something that I'm so used to pretending that it doesn't. And I'm trying to get better at being like, instead of saying this is fine, I'm always trying to like reframe it, especially like my goal for 2025 is like reframing that into saying like, this is normal for me, as opposed to like, this is fine. Because theoretically, chronic pain is never fine. So I think we all say it's fine because we're used to it, but that's a different sentiment than fine. So I think she's really taught me that, and that like will stay with me, I think, forever. And that I didn't know that that's what I was missing from my care until someone just like looked me in the eyes as like a human being. And it was like, "I'm so sorry you just spent a week in the hospital for something that we can't solve, really couldn't treat, and that you could like barely move." Like those are all like sucky things. And she acknowledged it. And I was like, "Oh, I'm allowed to say it sucks." I was like, "Oh, this feels like way better." Whereas before I was just like, "Yeah, that's just chronic illness life. Like it happens." And I was like really not letting that sit. But she kind of allowed that to happen. And that kind of opened up just a lot of even just like inner healing too, just to have someone on my side that was like, "This sucks." And I was like, "You're right. It does." And that I think will be my memorable moment for probably forever when I think of like good practitioner care.
That's perfect. It's like, you know, it it's a seemingly small gesture, I guess,
Yeah.
but really it's not that small when you're the one like living through such hard things, and sometimes you just need to hear that, it's hard and know that you're heard.
Yeah, it was like one sentence. And even if you say it, like you don't have to back it up with anything else. It was just like simple. And like I know that she's carrying like behind the scenes, but even if like another practitioner that I had never heard it from even was like, "Oh, that sucks. Like let's see what we can do." That alone, I'm like, "Oh yeah, that does suck. Thank you for not being like, yeah, it's fine that you're in pain. Like we're good." Because if you don't acknowledge it, you're kind of accepting the alternate. Like if you're not saying that is wrong, you shouldn't be in pain, the subtle messaging is that your pain levels are fine. And that like sits with us, I think, deeper than we think because it's not said out loud, but like over and over again, if it's not treated as valid, then it starts to sink in that you're like, "Oh, yeah, like a 3 to 4 or 5 pain is totally fine because no one has acknowledged to me that it sucks, that like has medical training." So you're like, "Well, it must not like it's bad, but you're like, well, it must be like livable if no one's willing to do anything about it or like sit with you in that moment." So I just think that was really great. And like I think one of the first teams that I credit their like care with getting me back to like functioning and being the advocate that I am. And every year when I write them their Christmas cards, I'm always like, I'm able to advocate for other people and for more people because of your care. And I like want them to know that like it's not a small thing because the procedures that they've done for my spine have allowed me to sit on a plane. They've allowed me to go to DC, like all these things, and that's helping other people. So it's like by helping me, just by nature of what I do, you've now helped like hundreds of other people by default. And every year I write that, and they're always like, "That feels like too much credit to us." And I was like, "No, because otherwise I'd be home on the floor. Like without your care, I'd be on the floor and not advocating very well, or like for as many people. You can still advocate from the floor, but it's trickier." So I always mention that it's just like you can do a lot more than you think. I think if you think you're doing one small thing for someone, you never know what that's opening up to allow them to do and help the world beyond that.
Definitely. That is so insightful. And honestly, I feel like we could just keep talking all day, and I would love to do that because everything you've said today is so important, and I know that it will be meaningful to our audience. So thank you so much for taking the time today. I'm really excited for people to be able to hear this and to hear your advice and wisdom and just everything that you have learned from being a patient. I think the ways that you advocate for yourself online is really special, and a lot of people can learn from that.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate hearing that. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Where can listeners find you on social media, and is there anything you're working on now that you want to share about?
Yeah, so on Instagram, it is at underscore owning my story, one word, and then another underscore. If you find it, it'll say Abbey Hauser dash owning my story as the name. And if you want to do views from the floor, it's views from the floor with underscores between everything, and then one more after the floor. A lot of things were taken. I don't know who else is doing views from the floor, but that one was a hard one to get. And then if you go to my website currently, you can visit it. You just have to like go through the security thing. Hopefully it'll be up and running in at some point when I solve tech issues. But that is www.owningmystory.com. And then if you ever like want to contact me, you can reach out on Instagram. Otherwise you can email me at abby@owningmystory.com. And I'm happy to connect and chat and just talk advocacy or see what we can do. But those are my main platforms. I think I exist on other things, but I don't. I don't engage. Instagram's my main go-to.
All right, I will put those handles and email in the description boxes so that listeners can follow along and find you. Thank you so much,
Perfect.
Abby.
Yes, thank you for having me.